BierTalk. Gespräche über und beim Bier.
Hello and welcome to another episode of our podcast, BierTalk. Today we go to the Americas, so as well to the States, also to Brazil, and we meet Max Raffaele, who is a hop grower, but also an inventor and a very interesting person of the beer world. And I'm very happy we met in Wolnzach at the German Hop Museum. And then I instantly thought that would be an interesting guest for our podcast. And so I'm happy that you are here today. And maybe you do a little introduction of yourself for our listeners. Hello, Max.
Hello and good morning. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to have this conversation. I am American, born in the United States. About 15 years ago, I started traveling to Brazil. I had met a woman, a Brazilian, and started going to Brazil. About 10 years ago, I was making craft beer and decided to get involved in the hop growing as a hobby, which started the whole history of my love of the wonderful hop plant and craft beer.
That sounds very interesting. So originally you're a brewer?
Yes, just a home brewer. My 20 liters or 5 gallons at a time. Nothing super serious. Believe me, in the beginning, I made some pretty bad beers. But every beer is drinkable.
Of course. And as we always say, with the home brewers, you get the best beers in the world and the worst beers in the world. That's just it. It's both. You can have both. And it's always very interesting. And also, as I am also a professional photographer, it's the same. People buy big cameras and make photos. And of course, they are the best because they make it. So that's, but that's totally okay. But maybe first, how did you personally come into homebrewing, or what did you do before? What is your normal life looked like before that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a civil engineer and professional land surveyor with my own business for over 25 years, but recently retired since I started to the hops. But it was just the love of beer in general. They opened a small brew pub here in the town that I live in. They got me more interested in drinking craft beer. And then one of my actual workers had made beer. And I went to his house and helped one day. And then next thing, I bought a small kit. And that started my beer making back in probably 2007, 2008, around that time.
Did you have any favorite beer styles or favorite beers you made?
Well, I quickly gravitated more towards the Belgium styles. To me, to this day, it's the best beer in the world, but it has definitely its own style. Although I don't drink it enough, I think. But I really liked that style and experimented a little bit, not much with that. Once I started growing hops, I had enough friends that made beer that I would just give them my hops and they would make beer and I would get free beer for my hops.
That's a very good idea. It's faster, it's easier, and you have a huge variety. So you first fell in love in Brazil, or you first fell in love with the hops?
I had been in Brazil prior to really becoming a connoisseur. As a youngster, let's say adolescent or 20-year-old, I drank Heineken beer, which back then, all my friends were Budweiser or even the cheaper beers than that, the cheapest you could get. But I was always something like that, a little bit better, a little bit different, at least had a little bit of hops in the beer. So I think I easily gravitated towards the hoppier styles.
So you then also decided to start with hop planting, hop growing. How did that come? Because as far as I know, it's not so easy. So you cannot go to a normal plant shop and just buy a hop and put it on your shelf or whatever. So how did that come and how did you get into it?
Yeah, it was in 2010 that I went to my local brew supply shop where I bought my malt and my hops to make my beer, my pellets and the supplies. And one spring, he had rhizomes for sale. Knew nothing about growing hops, and I bought 2 rhizomes and that first year and planted them in pots. And they grew, to my surprise, on 2 strings tied to a tree. And I probably got maybe 50 cones per plant, which I used to make beer. And at the end of the year, when I cut the plants, I threw the rhizomes and the roots and everything out, and didn't even realize that they will grow back the following year.
That's great. Do you remember which variety it was?
They were Cascade.
Wow, so the famous American craft beer hop, fantastic. And you made a beer with these 50 cones?
Yes, I sure did.
And you liked it, of course.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was special, although I picked the cones way too soon. But I didn't know any better. But they were green and pretty and beautiful, and I showed all my friends, and I was really proud that first year for sure. And but hey, like I said, the beer wasn't really the best because it was too early, and they were had more of a grassy aroma than that real citricy or grapefruity flavors that you get from Cascade. But regardless, like I said, there's no beer that gets thrown out.
So, and the next year it came back from nothing, or
no, I had thrown the plants out, and the following year I bought 4 rhizomes from the same brew supply store. It was selling rhizomes again, and I bought 2 Centennial and 2 Cascade. And then I started looking online a little bit and realized that they do grow back each year. So do not throw them out at the end of the fall.
Fantastic. So, and that grew, and then you had your 4 hops, and next year you had 8, and then 16, or?
Well, I actually went online and bought some different varieties. Within like 3 years, I had about 20 plants in containers. They were more of not really pots. They were pretty big, huge, the kind of storage container, plastic tubs. All with strings tied up into the trees, really as just a hobby to make my beer. Then I was giving them away to my friends that made beer also. My one worker, I always gave a bunch to him. And they were making a lot more beer than me at that point with my hops. So I was drinking the beer they made, but it was my hops.
So it was also a little bit your beer, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was, and then it was a business idea.
Yeah. What happened was in 2015, I actually took 1 rhizome to Brazil. I had a home down there. I had this was a girlfriend that became my wife eventually in Brazil. So I had bought a home, and I was going back and forth, and I had brought 1 rhizome in my luggage and planted it down in Brazil in a pot. The property that I owned didn't even have any grass or lawn, but it had a patio. It was paved. And I bought a pot and planted the plant and started growing 1 plant down in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. And I posted it online on the craft beer group of Sao Paulo, which had about 20,000 members at the time, a picture of the plant just sprouting, maybe about 1 or 2 inches tall. And at least a few hundred people immediately commented that you cannot grow hops in Brazil. Everyone told me online that you can't grow hops in Brazil. And then the plant got to be about 6 or 7 feet tall. I posted another picture, and it got to be about 1,000 people posting how the plant's going to die shortly. It's not going to work. And then the plant got to be as tall as my 2-story home, probably 18 or 19 feet tall, bushy, climbing up a string. And I posted again, and every time I posted on that group, it caused like a whole political thing almost.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like the story of the bumblebee, or all the people say it isn't able to fly if you research that academically, but it flies. Or like the Cathedral of Cologne, an architect say it will never be able to stand. But it stands, and it even survived the war. So yeah, so hop is growing in Brazil. You made the proof.
Yeah, well, the plant, at the point that it was started to get burrs and flower, everyone said, no way, it's not going to get cones. And then in the meantime, I brought 20 more rhizomes and planted them there in my patio, and they all grew, although not as tall, because they were starting to flower. And the plants started to get cones, and as it turned out, my mother-in-law had a piece of ground that was overgrown right in the city that was just weeds, that about maybe a half of an acre, which and I started clearing the land, chopping back all the weeds, and I ended up planting the plants in the ground. It was Christmas Day, actually, in 2015. The plants got planted in the ground, and by the beginning of March, I had 6 varieties and about 20 plants. They all had cones. Some had 10 cones, some had 100 cones, probably was the maximum. They were spindly little plants going up some bamboo post that I had put in the ground. And but they all flowered, and when I posted pictures on the same group, everyone said they have no oils, there's no lupulin, there's no alpha acids. But I knew personally from touching them how sticky and how oily they were, and they felt at least just as oily as in the US, and even the smells, the aromas. And I was convinced that you can grow hops in Brazil. The only difference is they need more water. I always felt like if you're at the beach and it's hot, you drink more water.
Yeah.
So if I'm in Brazil where it's hotter and there's more sun, just give the plants plenty of water, and I don't see why they won't grow. And as it turned out, there was a beer sommelier from Sao Paulo, semi-famous guy that a lot of people knew. And he got in contact with me through Messenger and wanted to come and visit and see for himself my hops plants. So he came by a day or two later, and he ended up confirming what I already knew, that, yeah, these hops look great. The cones have oils, lupulin, smell awesome. And he actually posted himself on Facebook. And that started the flood of people who wanted hops plants or hops rhizomes, who decided they wanted to grow hops.
So you got more or less the father of the Brazilian hop growers.
Well, as it turns out, and I didn't know at the time, there was another fellow who had brought seeds, or had a friend who brought seeds from Canada that had already been growing these variety that is kind of a new variety that from a seed, because every seed is its own new variety, prior to me, but independently. So he gets a lot of credit too for, as it turned out, he had a lot of plants growing of this certain variety that kind of adapted to the Brazilian climate and weather. People don't realize in Brazil, everyone thinks that we're all in the Amazon and it's a rainforest and it nonstop. They do have definitely their seasons, the rainy season and the sunny season or dry season, but not everywhere is it raining every day. like people would think. So the weather is more extreme with the temperature for sure, and there's a lot of dryness. So you definitely need irrigation, different than in Europe. But to me, the only difference really was to give them more water, and they will grow. I always liked gardening myself from back in my college days and even after. So my mom was a heavy, big-time gardener. I was always her helper. But in the end, I ended up taking 4 of the varieties, Cascade, Brewer's Gold, Sass, and Centennial, and bringing cones back to the U.S. and sending them to a lab in the U.S. to be tested. And every one, the alpha acids were at the top or above the norm for each variety. Even with our Columbus hops came at like 20.1% alpha acids.
Wow. So it's a great success. And when I'm thinking of it, I think it's 2 things. It's on one side, my experience in Brazil was that the nature is so strong. So if you have some place where maybe you cut a tree or you cut grass or whatever, if you come back a week later, it's all full of new green. So it's a very, very active nature. And so I think it's very fertile. And also Sao Paulo is in terms of Brazil, it's quite south. So you as you said, you have more like seasons. And I also think in Europe, we always not thought about planting the hops more south because it was dry anyway, and no one said, okay, maybe you can plant hops maybe in Sicily or something like that. We always thought of growing them more in the north. We still do because of the climate change. And there a big problem is the light, because in the north, the daylight gets much longer in the summertime and much less in the wintertime. So that seems to be a problem for hops. But maybe it's not that problem if you have the shorter daylight time, if you go more to the south, or otherwise if you look in the southern hemisphere, maybe Sao Paulo is like Sicily if you see it in the southern hemisphere. So, but it's more fertile, and maybe if you irrigate, maybe you have even a better chance of growing good hops. So, did you realize something with the daylight time? Does that change something?
Well, yes, that is a huge factor where we are in Sao Paulo, in the very far south of Brazil. The daylight difference between summer and winter is significant. Where we are, it's about 10 and a half hours in the winter and 13 and a quarter in the summer, which really isn't enough to keep the plants from flowering. You really need about 15 hours of sunlight during the summer or the plants flower. So what we do on our plantation is we actually have a system of LED lighting that we put above the trellis, on the whole trellis, similar to what they did in South Africa for years. They use artificial lighting. It's a little different system now. The technology is a lot better. So, and people say, wow, but the electric bill, it's really insignificant. It's their 12 watt or 13 watt LED lamps that we actually turn on 5 hours a night from about 5 p.m. till 10 or 11 p.m. And it just adds some light at the end of the day to really just keep the plants from flowering. The first year there, when I first really started seriously to grow the hops, not on this little plot, I eventually made a partnership, and we have a farm with about 75 acres, and not all planted with hops. But when we first planted the first 1,000 plants, the first year, the plants grew about 8 or 9 feet tall, like 3 meters total, and flowered. So I realized that it's not going to work where we were. As it turned out, the farm is further north from the city of Sao Paulo where I was. So the little bit of difference really made a difference in the flowering of the plants. And when I first was growing in this small plot, some of the varieties flowered early, but some of them didn't. I was right on the border of that photo period that the hops need, because each variety is a little bit different. And even in South Africa now, they don't use lights anymore because they've actually bred varieties that don't need lights, that work without them.
So you also developed new varieties now?
Well, yeah, part of our business is developing new varieties. We're actually now into this will be the fifth year. I have a hop yard in the U.S., the state of Pennsylvania. It's small. It only has about 200 plants, full-size plants. But each year I germinate 1,000 seeds approximately. And I start them in a small grow room over the winter and get them growing with LED lights. And then we plant them in the hop yard, very densely planted, close together for the first year. And as it turns out, hops have male and female, so you end up throwing out about 40% turn out to be male. And then you end up having plants that just don't evolve well. In the end, you end up with about 200 plants that we let grow out the full year and flower. And then we test the cones we send them out and smell. I usually take a bunch of cones every day to the local brew pub of my own varieties for them to smell and see what they think, to get their ideas. I've actually given them some cones. They made a couple brews with some dry hops. I don't have enough cones to really make a brew with one plant. So that's a big part of our breeding program. What happens, the plants, once they pass the second year here, if I continue with them, I take them to Brazil, and we've now have a breeding program down there. It's really, the idea is to create plants in Brazil that are both adapted to the photo period and the climate. I think the world needs plants that are better adapted to hot and dry climate. Where our farm is, it's really dry. We go 4 months with no rain whatsoever, believe it or not, in Brazil. There is a rainy season, what they call it, for about a month, about February and March, where it rains, no monsoon every day type thing, but they call that the rainy season. So yeah, the breeding program for us is hopefully a big part of the future. To make new varieties takes up to 10 or more years to prove both. There's so many things involved to create a new variety of hops that people don't even consider. But this year, we got approved last year, and the project just started this year from the government of Sao Paulo, where we got a grant to actually study 5 varieties that are now going into their third year. And we got help from the government to both pay for employees, to mount a lab at our farm to do our own alpha and beta acid testing, and also to do in vitro fertilization right there at our farm. If that continues, hopefully there's the second phase, which starts next year, we're going to apply for. And hopefully in a few years, we're going to have some better varieties of hops for both Brazil and the world.
Wow, that really sounds great, especially because if you have success there, you can spread that around the planet. That's really great. Wasn't there a lot of attention by the professional big hop growers and hop communities and companies in the world Did they come to you?
Well, honestly, not yet. We're really so small in Brazil that that the people don't even realize that we're even growing hops down there. It's the word's getting out now. I've been to Yakima now twice and visited a few farms. Just last year, Brazil joined the International Hops Growers Convention as a legitimate country that's really growing hops commercially. This last trip, I was in 4 different countries talking to farmers. So I think so far, people are still a little bit in disbelief, honestly, especially out there in Yakima and where the farms are 2,000-3,000 acres. But we have a long way to go, to catch up with even Germany, or the U.S. is out of the possibility, but to catch up with any of the even top 10 growers in the world. We're I think probably in last place on the International Hops Growers Convention list of acres planted. But the amount of people and their projects that are getting started is growing exponentially, both in quantity and size down there in Brazil.
Yeah, and you have the 3rd largest beer market of the world in your back. So that's also a good thing. And maybe you are at the moment a little bit under the radar, but I think when people also maybe from the big German or international communities like BierTalk will maybe also listen to the podcast. I don't know, we had also already some of them as guests here. They will notice that something is going on. And I think I remember you also told me something very interesting, so that you were able to make even 2 harvests in a year. Is that really possible?
Yes, that's actually our advantage down there that makes it really viable as a business, is that with the use of the LED lights, we really control the moment of harvest. The plants grow very quickly with the amount of radiation that hits the plants. And so the day that we turn out the LED lights, within 2 or 3 days, the plants start flowering. And within 6 to 8 weeks, we are picking cones. So twice a year, and even there are at least 1 or 2 farms that are trying to attempt to get 3 a year. Their 3rd harvest is a little bit smaller because it's starting to get cold. We do have what they call a winter, a month of maybe 15 degrees Celsius at night. But everyone is getting, with the use of lights, 2 harvests per year. We're not getting the yield per harvest that you would get in Germany or in other areas, but definitely with the 2 harvests, I suspect we're going to get a better yield shortly at some of the farms that are really perfecting this system using the lights.
That really sounds great. Even 3 harvests a year. Fantastic. So I think as you said, there's a lot of way to go. So what are your actual plans? Are you more focusing on more research and more breeds, or more on making bigger, larger farms, or more selling plants, or having own production? So what is your idea for maybe the next 5-6 years?
Well, what I did at the point where I saw way back in 2015-16, when everyone started wanting to buy rhizomes from me, I actually brought a luggage bag full of rhizomes and sold them. But I realized to do things legitimately, I had to legalize a business and really do it right. So I imported at this point 26 different varieties straight from the USDA Clean Plant Network through in vitro fertilization that went into quarantine into Brazil. And so far, our focus on our farm has been supplying the other farmers with clean plants. Rhizomes aren't even legal to sell in Brazil. You have to sell plants. They're much easier to trace as far as viruses and funguses. So up till now, we've really reinvested on the farm in mainly the production of hops plants and our little lab, where we start with in vitro plants so we can guarantee cleanliness and virus-free starters for other farms. And that's really, fortunately for us, paid the bill so far. And we really, at this point, only have a little less than a hectare planted of hops that we have grown out and basically sold fresh hops so far to a local brewery, probably I think the number 3 or 4 in Brazil. A brewery is very nearby. They're really more popular for their lagers and less hoppy beers, but they are now starting to get into more of a craft beer type scene. I think they realize that the market in Brazil is huge. One thing the Brazilians, when I first went there 15 years ago, I couldn't even find Heineken. It was really hard to find. And the craft beer didn't exist. They were way behind the world and the US, really, which was the leader. And they've way caught up with craft beers now. They're right there on some of the world competitions. They're winning a lot of medals in Brazil. So the beer and the market for different kinds of hops has really, really grown in Brazil. And like you said, it's number 3 in the world for beer drinking, and 100% of the hops is imported. Up till now, 99.8% probably.
You are working on it. And I was judging several years now for the Brazilian beer competition in Blumenau. And that was an impression I had that really they have the problem to get fresh quality hops. So every IPA you had, it was a little bit more damp. I don't know, but not that freshness, not that crispiness that you can expect from maybe a Yakima IPA or something like that. So that will really be very interesting. And of course, if you want, you can drop some names. So if I come to Brazil, or maybe if I get beers, are there breweries who are using your hops? Can you have some examples?
Well, the brewery that uses ours is Trieste, which is actually a city in Italy. The name and it's a family from there. Yeah. So we haven't sold to any other breweries. That's a huge brewery. If we just have them as our only client, we'll probably be good to sell them 100 acres of hops each year. But at this point, most of the breweries are using fresh hops in their beer, at least in small quantities. It's tough to convince breweries to change. I found that. But definitely in Brazil, the word has gotten out. In the beginning, even the brewers said that hops grown in Brazil can't be any good, can't have any quality. And I think that like some of the varieties, especially like Comet, they're getting 15-16% alpha acids, which is way above the norm. Cascade also, SAS. Some of the farms are really, really coming up with, and every variety that I've tested from Brazil is always high on the scale of what's normal in the world, let's say, for alpha acids. So I think that the word is getting out, especially in Brazil. I said that the world doesn't know, but Anheuser-Busch is actually in Brazil, and they did just, I think last year, opened up a processing center where they imported a wolf picker. They have a pelletizer, and they have a program kind of interesting where they give away 1,000 plants for free to local farmers to grow hops. And then they buy the hops at the end of the season is their plan. It's only a year in, but to see them investing in Brazil to me is amazing and really gives a lot of credence to what we're doing down there, because I'd say 3-4 years ago, I watched a little YouTube, I think, or maybe it was a live thing from the fellow from Anheuser-Busch saying how it would never be possible to grow hops in Brazil.
It's really fascinating, and I think if they do it, they really know what they are doing, especially economic-wise. And also in Hallertau in Germany, they have a big hop farm and a research center just next to the German hop research center. So that's really also interesting how they look for things and trying to drive things forward. And that maybe leads me to my last question about the hops. In Europe and also in America, we always have the problem with illnesses or diseases or with bugs or things. How is it in Brazil? Does the hop has any trouble growing, or is it at the moment so new that it can do whatever it wants?
Well, when we started, my idea was to import clean plants from the USDA. I'm the only one that's done that. I was the first one to import plants through quarantine. There is a way to open a legal greenhouse to sell plants. Let me back up a little. In Brazil, every plant is accounted for. They're very strict on the regulations to sell. Each variety has to be approved, go through quarantine. There's a whole process to prove the genetics. And so a lot of other people open greenhouses and are still selling plants now that are full of virus or mildew. And a lot of farms have had huge problems, especially with downy mildew. They have what they call the rainy season, more down in the south where it rains a lot more. And people have pulled out 1,000, 2,000 plants that were so infected with disease that because they started out trying to skimp on the cost and get cheaper plants or cheaper material to start with. So fortunately, so far, knock on wood, nothing has come up like strange. That was my biggest concern with this whole, I call it an adventure, but that there's going to be some kind of a bug that doesn't exist in the hop growing regions of the world that could be in the Amazon or somewhere near that's going to cause major problems for hops growers. But so far, it's the same diseases that they have in Hallertau and around the world. Basically, if you get people that are selling plants that they brought over, that they bought from a friend in some other country, which has happened a lot, and not start out with clean stock, very quickly you're going to find out within a year or two. So I think the problems that we have are very similar to what the world has. At our farm, we're disease-free so far. I mean, there's always a chance someone's going to come. Fortunately, downy mildew, powdery mildew are specific to hops. So our plants are beautiful. We never spray them with anything. We've been organic so far and hope to keep it that way, God willing.
Yeah, that also sounds good, so that it's really organic hops. So I really cross my fingers for you, for the project, for the hops. That really sounds great. Thank you very much for your time, for the information to share with us. And yes, as I said, have a good luck with your hops, and I'm looking forward to meeting you maybe in place in Sao Paulo and have a look at the hop myself. So it will be great. Thanks a lot, Max.
Hey, thank you, Marcus. It was nice meeting you that day. Nice talking to you today. We will definitely be in touch. And definitely when you come to Sao Paulo, let's drink some good Brazilian beer made with some nice, fresh Brazilian hops.
BierTalk, der Podcast rund ums Bier. Alle Folgen unter www.biertalk.de.